Mi nombre es Astrid Ayala, soy la directora del programa de maestría LLM en Finanzas de la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. Estamos listos para iniciar nuestra sesión del día de hoy. En nombre de la Escuela de Negocios de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, les damos la bienvenida y les agradecemos por su tiempo. Hoy estamos iniciando con la primera sesión de nuestro conversatorio virtual Fusiones, Adquisiciones y Reestructuraciones, oportunidades en época de crisis, desde una perspectiva legal y financiera. Recuerden que el conversatorio constará de 4 sesiones. El objetivo de este conversatorio es crear foros de discusión sobre nuevas oportunidades de negocio que se puedan encontrar frente a la incertidumbre actual. Se analizarán en concreto consideraciones legales y financieras prácticas que se plantean en contratos comerciales y operaciones de fusión, adquisición y reestructuración. Se tratará el impacto causado por la pandemia, así como las nuevas oportunidades para reinventarse. En la sesión de hoy abordaremos el tema ¿Cómo ha cambiado la compra-venta de negocios y su financiamiento? La discusión girará en torno de oportunidades en distressed assets, qué áreas de la práctica legal se activarán después de experimentar la pandemia, cambios en las estructuras de compra-venta y el financiamiento de las mismas, entre otros. Esta sesión se impartirá en idioma inglés. Esperamos que tengan una buena experiencia y que continúen acompañándonos en las siguientes sesiones. El licenciado Jorge Luis Arenales nos apoyará como moderador de estas sesiones. Jorge Luis tiene un LLM de Northwest University Pritzker School of Law, un posgrado en el programa de Instruction for Lawyers de Harvard Law School. Es socio de la firma Arias y se especializa en asesorar a empresas sobre fusiones, adquisiciones y asuntos corporativos y comerciales. Le cedo la palabra al licenciado Jorge Luis Arenales. Muchas gracias, Jorge.
Gracias, Astrid. Gracias a todos por su tiempo hoy. I will turn to English since we have an extraordinary panel with us. I'm very excited to kick off this seminar. This is the format is on a roundtable, so it will be a discussion between friends and colleagues. And of course, the purpose is to learn from the best. We have international practitioners with us in the M&A and banking and finance area. Today's subject, as Astrid mentioned, is how the M&A and finance landscape has changed due to COVID and your perspective on the near future. Our speakers are world-class practitioners in their respective fields. We're very happy to have them, and thank you, Paul and Ale, for taking the time for your busy agenda to join us. As an introduction, I will present Mr. Paul Schnell. He's a senior partner at Skadden Arps, New York. His practice focused on M&A, and I have said that Paul has been named one of the leading lawyers globally, and in the US, including areas such as an M&A, corporate, and he's #1 in all the chambers in Legal 500, Dragon, and Latin America and Brazil. He focused also on private equity, corporate governance, corporate finance, and healthcare. Paul is an extraordinary practitioner, and I will now introduce Alejandro Jaramillo. Alejandro Jaramillo is the Chief Commercial Officer of Bladex. He joined Bladex 8 years ago, and before he was the CCO, he was the head of the syndicated loans at Bladex. And before Bladex, he has a stellar career in BNP Paribas in New York. He was the director on the corporate and investment banking. So his focus has been always Latin America. Paul and Alejandro have extensive experience in Latin American deals, and I've been very blessed to have them as friends for many years and to work with them in various deals. So I will start a little bit of background of the discussion today. We saw a recent Harvard Business Review, an article that said what M&A looks like during the pandemic, and the authors really went out of this way and did a survey of 50 top executives and senior corporate development leaders, and they asked specific questions to them. One is the current deals in process as the time of the crisis hit, anticipated 2020 deal volume, and the top deal type strategic objectives in the future. The results were interesting in respect of the current deals. The survey showed that 51% of the deals stopped due to the pandemic. The deal volume, how much was reduced to 23%. The data reveals an important, encouraging, counterintuitive growth strategy for those executives and companies prepared to turn the crisis into opportunity. They noted a significant percentage reporting either that no impact in the 2020 forecast deal volume has, or their intent to accelerate the deal volume during the remaining of the 2020 year, based on increased number of opportunistic targets and more palatable valuation brought about the crisis. I may say distressed assets. The deal type and objectives as well, the survey shows 57 of the respondents emphatically indicated that their intent to continue to do strategic revenue growth deals like their core acquisition strategy over the next following months. Mergers and acquisitions are notoriously difficult in any environment, and post-COVID, they may be even harder. As one of the survey respondents indicated, it's been over 10 years since we've been through about doing the distressed deal. I am not sure we've ever had a playbook for it. Another surveyor said divestitures cannot be considered acquisitions spelled backwards because they have a completely different value curve than typical acquisitions. And finally, the additional cybersecurity risk that may incur from extensive work from home operations makes careful due diligence all the more important. So we're facing a different scenario on a very complex field. And today is the International Monetary Fund annual meeting, in which I can say that they have said that besides the public debt of all the countries trying to start economies, one of the most challenges is to have the fiscal incentives taken away too soon to companies making business and developing any type of strategies. So further ado, I will start the conversation, and I will let, of course, Alejandro and Paul be as calm as possible to have this nice conversation between friends. I have to say, we have astounding attendance. We have more than 650 attendees and from various countries. So this has been a very well received seminar. We have people from business, the banking side, the business community, as well from any type of deals. And we have, of course, many of our colleagues as law firms watching. So thank you very much, everyone, to take your time for this interesting topic. We are going to go on a round table. At the end, we will have a little bit of time to respond to some of your questions. So please, free to write them. We will try to respond as many as possible. And thank you very much. So let's start. Okay. So both of you, Paul, you are a New Yorker for all your life, and Alejandro, you lived there for more than 10 years. New York is a financial center with a high influence in Latin America. Could you share with us how you look at Latin American market in the field of M&A and finance before COVID and in COVID era? So I will start with you, Paul, and then please, Alejandro, join.
Thank you. Hi, hello, everyone. My thanks to the university, to Jorge for this opportunity. Alejandro, it's an honor and pleasure to be on the same panel with you. I wish we could be doing this in person, but everything else in life is moved to the screen. So I'm happy to do it even on screen. Apologies for not speaking in Spanish. I've always said that in my next life, when I'm giving presentations, I'll learn how to do that in Spanish. We are in such interesting times. M&A has been affected in so many interesting ways by the pandemic, like everything else in life. I'm not sure that the outlook from an international U.S. perspective about doing business in deals in Latin America has changed all that much in terms of an overall view of the region. I think international investors view Latin America as a great opportunity to do deals in, to make investments. I think that fundamentally remains true today. There is more caution, I think, today that is affecting current activity. And Latin America is just too big a market not to be in. To be more precise about how I've always heard Latin America described by international investors since I got involved was that it's viewed as a higher opportunity as well as a higher risk market, and also a place where the level of risk and the level of opportunity can vary quite dramatically with some volatility from time to time. On the opportunity side, companies in mature countries, mature industries look for opportunities to grow their business. And I can't tell you how many board meetings I've been in over the years where the topic always is, where do we get more growth? Now, that may not be true for an Amazon, but for many companies, that is. And the easy answer to that is look at emerging markets that have a history of more recent history of higher growth opportunities. And people like Latin America compared to some of the other emerging markets in terms of the similarity of the cultures, in terms of the strength of the democracies, the rule of law, regulatory predictability. So relatively speaking, it can be an attractive market. That will continue. There are challenges today. There will be challenges through the pandemic, which we're going to talk about. And then I think maybe the higher risk, I know we're going to talk about that later on, but of course, with opportunity comes more risk.
Thank you, Paul. Alejandro, do you care to comment a little bit about your experience in finance deals in Latin America from your perspective, where were you located in New York and now that you're located in Panama?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jorge. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel, and thank you very much to Universidad Francisco Marroquín. Very happy to be here with all the people viewing us and listening to us, and it's a pleasure, Paul, to be on a panel with you as well. So as you correctly stated, I mean, M&A has always been a very exciting field because, this is what sort of, creates growth opportunities for companies. In my case, in most recent years, being based in Latin America, what we have been seeing a lot, which is actually something fascinating in the region, is the growth of what we like to call multilatinas. So we have seen a lot of economic integration. We have seen companies from Mexico acquiring companies in South America. We have seen a lot of South American groups entering into the Central American region. Within Central America, you have seen some consolidation, and there's been movements in terms of international players either coming into the market or exiting the market, also creating M&A opportunities. So what we have seen, of course, when we arrived to the COVID crisis or the COVID pandemic, there had been a lot of activity, and that activity obviously has been put sort of on hold for a while. But at the same time, there's been sort of like a K effect, where you have companies that are arrived to this crisis very well positioned and with very sort of solid financial condition, financial indicators, with growth prospects. So very solid players that in fact are have activities in very defensive sectors, very resilient sectors. So even during the crisis, they have been growing. Some companies in the food and beverage business, companies, of course, working in healthcare or consumer goods in general, have been doing very well throughout the crisis. So companies and in several other industrial sectors, packaging, etc. Paper, tissues. So at the end of the day, what we have already seen happening, and it's likely to create opportunities, is some of the stronger players in the region are probably are starting to look now at opportunities to perhaps acquire or become partners in firms that are, or companies that are probably not doing so well because they arrived to the crisis in not so good shape, maybe highly levered, low capitalization in general. So there's going to be opportunities for companies to either acquire other companies or merge and create strategic partnerships throughout the region. And I think the multi-Latina concept is going to continue. And then there's also a second factor that I think it's going to generate opportunities, and it's the trade tensions between the US and China has already started to create opportunities for the Latin American region. And it's very likely that you're going to see international players trying to do some M&A transactions with Latin American players so that they can benefit from a more sort of south to north trade corridor and substitute what's likely to basically slow down between the US and China. And then the other factor that also generates opportunities is that currencies have devaluated. So it's also a good time for international players with hard currency to enter into acquisitions in the region.
Thank you. Very interesting points, Alejandro and Paul. You mentioned one word that I am very familiar with, which is resilience. I'm always fascinated about the resiliency of the business people and the business community that face crisis. And we as lawyers, with Paul and you as a banker, I believe that you agree with me that you are amazed about the resilience on how they are going to prosper on this time of difficulties. Saying that, you can look at the end of the year as pessimistic or opportunistic. And I guess this is how you are going to deal with your end of the year financials. What are the most common concerns right now for an international investor doing business in Latin America? Have you seen anything related to government stability, economic politics? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I would say there's a list of them that you know, and again, many of these I think will sound familiar. And I think the challenge, these are issues in any deal, in a domestic deal, but I think they're more difficult in a cross-border deal. And look, a very high percentage of cross-border deals are not successful in the sense that they don't create additional value, something like 40% of deals. So they're hard to do. And I can just quickly go through sort of a list that I've seen over the years. To me, the two most important things are cultural, finding a common cultural fit, and creating trust between the counterparties. And over distances, different ways of doing things in countries, different ways of doing business, that becomes harder. And the pandemic has made that more difficult. On the cultural side, and I was just talking to an old friend in Brazil about an interesting episode we had, to me, which shows the challenges on the cultural side. A number of years ago, I went to Sao Paulo with a U.S. client, very senior group, big, little bit full of themselves type company for some meetings in Brazil during the World Cup. And the day that the CFO and the general counsel wanted to have the meeting turned out to be a day that Brazil had a World Cup game. And we tried to discourage them from having the meeting, but they needed to get back to their home, so they insisted. So we had a meeting in a conference room of our law firm. And as the meeting went on, people started wandering off and not coming back. And at one point we looked around, the only people left in the room were Americans or the general counsel of our subsidiary who didn't look very happy. So we went out of the conference room, the place was deserted. Then we hear this cheer and we open up a door and everybody else who was at the meeting is watching Brazil play the game. So that deal did not get done. And I'm convinced that that's what caused it. 8 years later, and this is true, I'm back in Brazil The World Cup is going on. Brazil has a game. I tell this story to our American client that time. The American client says to the counterpart, and Americans, they don't understand the importance of the World Cup. They say the client, senior person said, look, I understand how important this game is. We're not going to interfere with your ability to watch it. Let's maybe work for an hour or two in the morning. You guys can go home. If you want to stay with us and have a celebratory lunch, you're welcome to join us. We've arranged for lunch. And then the next morning, everybody shows up on our side with Brazilian football jerseys, except for one person. There was a guy from Argentina on our team, and he refused to wear a Brazilian jersey. And that deal got done. So to me, that's just one example of you got to find a cultural fit. The more business-related ones, of course, so we could talk more about. In terms of trust, if you can't create trust, no deal is going to get done. And again, it's tougher when you have different cultures, different languages, distances. In the COVID, all this is exaggerated and much harder. If you don't develop trust, even the most economically compelling deal is not going to get trust. If the buyer doesn't trust that the seller is going to be absolutely transparent in diligence, and they get any even subtle indication that the seller's holding back, the deal's going to be off. And sellers say to me, I'm trying to get the highest price. I'm trying to sell my business. I don't want to tell them about the things that the problems that I have. How can I get the highest price? You can't get a deal done. And the same thing on the seller side. If all the buyer wants to talk about is FCPA and corruption, or if they're threatening to renegotiate the price, or to fire the employees, whatever, without that trust, that won't get done. So that to me is two issues. The third issue, and again I call it a threshold issue, is what international investors call country risk. Are they willing to take the risk? Again, this is the opposite side of the higher opportunity, political, economic, volatility, cyclicality. So that's another issue that buyers have to get over. And again, I think with things lagging a little bit in Latin America, that's more of an issue today. Relative attractiveness is another issue. It may not matter how Latin America is doing or not doing, and I'll say it for the second time. If everybody wants to invest in technology and go with the Amazon example, or invest in India, they have to look for attractive investments. I think Latin America right now is positioned as a good place, good pricing, whatever. Legal challenges, I have to talk about FCPA. The top three legal challenges, I think, are corruption, and corruption. And a lot of clients I have, and as many of my clients are from Latin America as they are from the US, they say, what is this irrational obsession that Americans have with the FCPA and with corruption? And it does seem irrational. And I've seen so many buyers lose deals by just pounding on this issue with sellers. So the seller says, look, if you think I'm a crook, let's not do a deal. And obviously you've not established trust. And what I try to explain to sellers is this may not be the biggest value issue, but in terms of reputational harm, in terms of the personal career of the senior person who many people have an FCPA problem, get fired immediately. In terms of the reputational harm and the prospect of an investigation and criminal prosecution, this is a unique and it's a serious area. And again, I encourage sellers to be patient, to put up with all the questions, the 20-page due diligence request on corruption. And also I explain, it's not really the buyer saying, we think you're corrupt. It's more the buyer saying, some of the practices you have, although they're legal in your jurisdiction, are not permitted under the FCPA.
Yeah.
And I want to know what you're doing because I could have a problem when I own the business. You can't, we're as corrupt in the US as any other place, but we've just legalized a lot of that. In many countries in Latin America, you can't make campaign contributions to politicians. In the US, you can, and you have to follow the rules, but you can't. So it's different. One's not worse or the other, but you got to take the issues and say how do they come out. I'll finish. Just a whole bunch of other legal issues, again, that are different in cross-border deals. You know, what is the scope of the diligence? What's the sale process going to be? Is the whole process more international style or domestic style? That the more international is, the more it'll make it comfortable for the buyer. Are you using a 75-page US style purchase agreement or a 10-page domestic style agreement? And obviously buyers are way more comfortable with a longer one. What's the governing law? What's a dispute resolution? What's the prevailing language? So there are a lot of additional challenges, and getting used to claims. You know, buyers say, look at how many labor claims this company has or how many tax claims they have. And you have to explain, look, that's the cost of doing business in some jurisdictions. You having 2,000 labor claims, that may not be a problem. It's a cost of doing business. So maybe I'll stop. Pause
Thank
with
you,
that.
Paul. I guess you hit the nails on many things that we as practitioners face when dealing with US or international investors trying to see Latin America as a place to invest. And you mentioned the FCPA, the corruption, and everything that it comes with it. But I think that I can conclude that in Latin America as a whole is kind of the same issues, right, in respect of these topics. And nevertheless, I think the region has evolved drastically in the right approach. I think more of the sellers are more knowledge about that issue than before. And I hope we are going to get there to have a better press than we have today, because the bad press in Latin America sometimes hits opportunities and doesn't allow us to conclude certain deals. Then I will ask the question to Alejandro, as you as a finance person, do you see these issues as well as Paul mentioned being relevant when you're analyzing a deal, Alejandro?
Sure, Jorge. I think, as you said, Paul pretty much hit all the right points. Very briefly, I would just emphasize that you know, one of the, especially with foreign investors, you know, when Paul mentioned the sort of the legal issues or the country risk, sorry, you know, what really may scare or may be a determining factor for investors is really the jurisdiction, basically, or the rules of the game, and to put it in practical terms. So, you know, to the extent that there are countries out there that are very volatile in terms of changing the rules of the game, changing the tax laws, the ability to the labor laws, the tax laws, the ability to extract dividends, for example. That uncertainty is what sometimes stops foreign investors in terms of doing business, or they're simply going to price that in, basically. Which at the end of the day could be a way to do it, but it affects the price. And then the second thing that I would add, generally speaking, as I mentioned right now, some currencies have devalued, and there could be some good opportunities for buyers. But at the same time, if devaluation continues, then it's going to be hard to, if the source of income of the target company is in local currency, and then at the end of the day you want to extract a return of your dollar investment, then you really have to keep an eye on the potential for more devaluation, for example. So I would add those two points.
Okay, so I can say that the return on investment on any kind of finance or acquisition is high where you're dealing with Latin America, but with a little bit more risk than more stable markets. I can conclude that between your participations, but I guess this allows me to have the final questions about this topic. Your key practical recommendations to international players trying to see as Latin America as a hotspot of investment or finance. What would be your key practical recommendations to start?
A few things. One, you already touched on from the Harvard Business Review. A number of years ago, the then head of Colgate-Palmolive, large consumer products company, one of the executives I've most admired over the years, almost single-handedly convinced his company to buy the biggest toothpaste company in Brazil called Colinos at the time. Nobody wanted to do it. There was a recession going on. There was a new antitrust law, a lot of uncertainty. And people were saying, nobody else is making acquisitions in Brazil now. Why are we doing it? And he forcefully said, that's the best time to do an acquisition, when there's less competition, when value is depressed. And that has been a foundational, wildly successful acquisition. So, if you're as you said, no gain if there's no risk, and think about things in the long term. Even if you're a private equity firm, you may hit some patches as you go through things, but think in the long term. A number of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a survey of limited partners of private equity firms, global people who invest in private equity firms, institutions. The single country that they most wanted to see more investment in by their private equity firms was Brazil. A year later, the first scandal, Petrobras, hit, and everybody said, we don't want to be in Brazil anymore. Prices went down, a lot of missed opportunities. And then a year later, 2 years later, Brazil sort of got things under control, and that's what happens. And if you had made those deals in the down cycle, when everybody else was running for the exit, you would have made a lot better deals. I think empathy is hugely important. Think about how your counterparty is looking at things. And I always say to American clients, I said, who have a tendency to be sort of pushy with their way as the right way, is your way is not the right way. Difference is not worse. It can be better, but it's just different. And think about how your counterparty is looking at the same issues that you're looking at. There may be an entirely innocent explanation. A corruption issue, to me, is a good example. If you don't know the region, invest over stages. Take a small stake, do a joint venture where if you like, and again, you really got to get to know your partner, but do a joint venture or a minority stake till you get to know it. Hire the best local advisors, legal, banking, whatever. The less you know the market, they can get you over the hurdles. And I find, and this is true in the US, the business worlds are relatively small in a sense. And if you want to know if you're dealing with the right person and you have a good relationship with a local banker or a local lawyer, I can't think of any country where I can't find out for a client, is that a person you want to do business with more than a single call? It's just a small. So local advisors are critical. And then I think international advisors who have dealt in the region, I think are critical too, again, to sort of do the translating that needs to be done. I can tell clients in many jurisdictions in Latin America is that what's the difference between a 75-page agreement that's governed by Brazilian law or US law? Really little difference. There are a couple of differences we'll have to take you back, but there aren't a lot of differences. And if you can calm down an American buyer who says, it's got to be US law, yeah, you can get over hurdles. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Alejandro, you have any key points or key practical recommendations on that?
Well, no, I mean, Paul is basically, has been, advising clients on the, both sell side and buy side. So, those processes, definitely bring a lot of lessons learned and with all the experience I think you've mentioned. some of the key practical terms. On my side, which is more on the financing of, potential acquisitions, the recommendations are more on sort of, ways to finance these transactions, right? And we can talk a little bit more about it as we go through, because some things, definitely change for these types of crises in terms of the types of structures that you're able to get, or the type of, access to funds in order to fund a transaction. But they're more, I would say, more technical or fundamental rather than practical. I think Paul really hit on those practical points.
Okay, I have a little things about your response before on the multilatinas.
Okay.
In Latin America, we are very proud of our companies. They are mostly family-owned and family-hold companies in some jurisdiction in Latin America. And we are going to talk about that specific topic in the next couple of modules in this seminar. But I want to raise an issue in respect of empathy as well as trust. Many of the deals for foreign investors and finance goes to multilatinas. And then you have to take into consideration that the empathy, the trust, the communication, how you communicate adequately in respect of Spanish and English language are very commonly known between your investment, but you reach out to many of these multilatinas and they are very well sophisticated. They have a very good legal team, and by curiosity, Paul and Alejandro, in your dealings in Latin America, have you seen that local law firms are very well sophisticated, more than before, in your experience in the last 10, 20 years? How it has been involved in the local practice, as you mentioned, that is a key factor to have a deal successfully?
I'm happy to start.
Sure, go ahead.
And I've been in the market for 25 years or so. The level of sophistication among the domestic firms has increased tremendously over that time. Not just law firms, but bankers, consultants, accountants, and that's because the sophistication and complexity of deals has developed tremendously, and has made certain deals possible that you couldn't do before if you can deal with the complexity. And I always say, and again, it's sort of not another cultural thing, like, don't call the other person the foreigner because you're the foreigner to them. And I try not to call local firms. I call them domestic firms, because they get so involved in some deals. They say, Skadden's the local firm. We just have you there for the U.S. Aspects of the deal. But when you have cross-border, when you have a regional play, that adds complexity tremendously. There's so much more regulation now, and I know the U.S. sort of pressured regulators early in the years ago to say there are no antitrust laws regarding mergers in many countries, including in Latin America. There was a new one when I started, in Brazil, and it's a little bit careful what you ask for. Now there are antitrust laws all over the region, all over the world, yeah. And they've added a whole additional level of complexity and lots of other regulation going on. So you need people to deal with that. Tax planning has gotten wildly more complicated. You need to know that. Securities law requirements for public companies is a whole another area. And again, some of the things I talked about, as the deal has become more, doing deals has become more international style, you need domestic lawyers who can handle a 75-page international style agreement. And I can't tell you how many deals I see where I'm brought in for a small aspect of the deal, and it's governed by, the laws of a country in Latin America. The law firms are, domestic law firms, and they're negotiating a full-blown agreement. And that's a long ways from, I was sent to a Latin American country when I was an associate there was some US regulation to look at the deal. And I remember asking the parties, I said, can I see the purchase agreement? And they handed me a press release. It was like 3 or 4 page press release. And I thought maybe it was a translation. So I'm sorry, not the press release, the purchase agreement. And they flipped to the last page, and the 2 parties, big banks, had signed the press release. And that was their purchase agreement. So how, you know, we've clearly come a long ways. The intensity of legal services has increased tremendously. Unfortunately, for the quality of life, lawyers in Latin America are now have as crazy an existence as U.S. lawyers do, on call 24/7. And again, if you look at, again, when I got started in the region, I remember a legal assistant coming into my office in tears, and I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, trying to put together a working group list, and I called this very eminent lawyer in a country in Latin America, and I said to the secretary, can I get the home phone number? And the secretary said, I can't give that out. And she said, well, the legal assistant said, well, maybe can I talk to the lawyer himself? And the lawyer gets on the phone and says, how dare you ask for my home phone number and think that you can bother me at home on the weekend? So, you know, again,
long days ago.
The days of gentlemen lawyers is gone. And I'd actually say another thing, a wonderful trend in Latin America is maybe you need to refer to gentle persons, not gentlemen. This region has done a much better job than the US in promoting and developing women lawyers into the senior ranks, partners, partnerships, and leaders in the profession. The last thing I think maybe I'll touch on it, as Alejandro and Jorge, you talked about the trend to have regional strategies. It's very interesting to me how many law firms are entering into alliances or full-blown mergers with other countries, firms in other countries, and sometimes with international firms. So,
Yes, absolutely. That was gonna be one of my points. From a financing angle, you know, especially for banks that do business, you know, in many countries throughout Latin America, the gold standard for credit documents and for facility documents and legal documentation in general is New York law. But having said that, you know, you need to work with a lot of domestic law firms. And our experience throughout the region is that, you know, the law firms throughout Latin America have very seasoned professionals, you know, lawyers that have studied abroad. They have, you know, studied in some of the major, you know, law schools in the United States. Many of the lawyers have also been able to work for some U.S. law firms for a while. And then, so they really bring a lot of value to the table and experience. And basically, when you're working on deals where you need you know, both a New York opinion and a legal opinion, you really need the domestic law firms to understand exactly what, you know, what's happening in terms of the New York law governed agreement. But at the same time, they also need to provide very, very key local input because, for example, tax matters are very specific to countries. It doesn't matter if you have a New York law governed agreement. You know, some tax matters are very specific. Labor matters as well. Anything related to, in the case of M&A, you need to, you know, follow all the antitrust, you know, regulations, which are all local, and you know, anything related to sort of the local law and local regulations, you need that very important input. So at the end of the day, that provides for very solid legal teams in both M&A and also typical credit facilities. And as Paul mentioned, I was going to say that what, you know, not only we've been, you know, very very, very happy. We felt very well supported by domestic firms, but it's also very nice to be able to work with a legal firm that has regional presence, because some deals are multi-jurisdictional deals, and it's very hard to sort of go around and try to put together a team of different law firms. So once you have one law firm that either has strategic alliances or their own firms, but based in several locations, that's very, very efficient and very valuable to transactions.
It's very good to hear that Latin America as a whole is evolving to meet the golden standard of New York law or US law in respect of governing law and the deals and finance. Also, I have to say that we don't have any kind of schedule as practitioners. We accustomed to the New York standards as well as the US law standards. And an example is you, Alejandro. You practice in New York for 10 years and then you move to Panama as in Bladex, which is an outstanding job and a real player in the field in trade and finance, in everything related to that area. So I think most of the people, I have received a lot of questions about one simple question that relates to many of the other questions, which is what has changed in the age of COVID in respect of the investments? Do you concur with the analysis that I read before on the Harvard Business Review that 51% of the cases are stopped and they are waiting to see what is going on? Or do you think that is somehow already surpassed and we are moving forward to the end of the year and deals are starting to take place and how you say, have a closing before the end of the year? What is your view on that in respect of you were working on a very good year and then this happened, we had 2 or 3 months to see what is going on, and then we are here in October and we are going to close the year. So what have you seen in the business side as well as the finance side on that?
Well, as a practitioner, it's been a fascinating period. And in my mind, there have really been a couple of phases of M&A activity since the COVID epidemic hit us. For the first few months, M&A basically stopped, I think, in the US, in Latin America, and around. And people were facing existential problems. How do they keep themselves, their families, their employees safe and healthy? Closing down offices, getting people set up to work remotely, figuring out what their liquidity situation or where their lines of credit they could draw on to increase their liquidity, figuring out what this epidemic meant for their companies, the various, would customers still buy their products and pay for them? Would vendors be able to deliver products on time? So there were just these fundamental issues that just outshadowed, pursuing a deal. And I to me, that was true here in the U.S., in Latin America. And the other thing we kind of sort of forget about now is at the time of when it started, there was a lot of concern that credit would dry up, that there'd be a financial meltdown like there was in the 2009 recession when financing became very tight, even more so in Latin America than here. And you can't do financing, you can't do deals without financing. In fact, the opposite turned out to be true. Initially in the US, there was a tremendous amount of financing where strong companies, middle, not so strong, financially distressed companies, their single focus was on maximizing their liquidity for the rough road ahead. And the banks and the markets turned out a tremendous amount of financing in a very low cost way. And you're seeing some of that in Latin America. It's lagging by a couple of months, but the debt and equity markets in Brazil have been incredible. And Alejandro can certainly talk more than that. After a couple of months, the sun rose in the morning and every day, and people began to get a little bit more comfortable with, they're surviving, with the target company surviving, and the risk you know, any deal, you have to allocate risk. What risk is the buyer going to take if there's a material adverse change? Is it their problem? What risk is the seller going to say? Is it their problem that there's no deal? And the risks are just so huge because nobody knew what the COVID meant. And the seller said, I'm not going to take a risk if there's a bad development and let the buyer walk away. And the buyer says, I'm not going to be stuck having to do the deal. As the risk got down into more manageable levels, people began to say, yeah, I can take some risk here and still do the deal. The technology for doing deals has changed and become a lot more complicated. And it's impacted every aspect of how you do deals. You know, I talked about building trust and, you know, between the principals and execs in the deals. You know, there's a careful, you know, mating ritual for lack of a better term for doing deals. And now you're doing it for the most part virtually. You know, what about those private dinners that the two principals had, you know, to get together? And I find in Latin America, one thing I like a lot about Latin America, more than in the US, is that where it's very professional, is that a lot of sellers in Latin America, they want the buyer to be their friend before they're ready to do a deal. And you know, maybe that's gotten a little bit less the case. Can you do this virtually? So to me, there are practical issues with the COVID. I've heard some executives say, it's a good thing we have those expensive private planes in the COVID because now we can go fly safely. Think about the challenge of due diligence. Due diligence is you have to figure out all the various ways, some obvious, some not obvious at all, of how the pandemic is affecting the target company now and in the future. And then they got to value what those effects are. You have to spend a lot more time advising senior management and boards of directors. What are the risks? I mean, I had one client who said, you're talking about all this medical stuff. I want a infectious disease expert to come talk to the board about these risks. So, you know, when I never saw that before. And negotiating the deal, everything's different negotiating the deal. I talked about material adverse change. If the pandemic causes a problem, whose risk is that? Is that accepted from the MAE or not? And then it's not just that, you know, everybody has this provision that people have not traditionally spent a lot of time focusing on it, which is that between signing and closing, the target has to run the business in the ordinary course. What happens if they have to close their facilities because there's an infection? Yeah. That's not in the ordinary course. What happens if they have to draw down on a line of financing? Most ordinary course provisions say you can't do any financing between signing and closing. And so the seller says, look, I got to agree to certain exceptions to the ordinary course in order to give me flexibility. I want
to jump there, Paul, because it's a very interesting topic you are mentioning. When the pandemic started, I remember that we as law firms and all of my colleagues were very well aware of the force majeure, the unprecedented events, and there was a really worry about the fulfillment of their agreements in respect of the COVID situation. And a lot of seminars were out there in respect of how the force majeure, the events of God, and unprecedented situations. And that was, I believe, March, April, May. And I don't know if you've seen in M&A deals with deferred closings as well as finance that you have certain caveats and certain obligations to fulfill. What was your experience on that? Did many defaults happen? Did many restructures happen? Or things just move smoothly without? So if you can elaborate on that, Alejandro and Paul.
Alejandro, I don't mean to keep going first. So.
No problem. You know, I think you can handle the sort of the legal aspects. We have seen, you know, and some sort of, you know, publicly announced M&A deals in the region where basically the deal went through, but you know, and this was announced, the pricing changed. So it was interesting to see that basically, you know, as soon as COVID took place, obviously all the cash flow projections, changed. So, the both, buyer and seller sat down and they revised the projections and the model, and they were able to agree on, continuing to close on the deal, but with revised pricing conditions. So that was interesting to see. Of course, there may be a lot of private discussions out there that have been put on hold because of the pandemic. But I guess one, just to add a couple, just to add some color on this, I think sort of a macro way to look at this is sort of to look at what's going on in the economy, right? And the IMF just published just now in October their most recent outlook of GDP growth.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's a little bit better than what they had projected back in June. So of course, in line with what Paul was saying, April was pretty much the worst month all over the world. And then you started seeing how economies started gradually opening. And right now, I mean, it's still going to be a reduction in GDP growth. Right now, the projection is negative 4.4% for this year on a global basis, the global economy. But then next year, it's going to rebound. It's going to grow 5.2% next year compared to this year. In the case of Latin America, unfortunately, if you take the region as a whole, it was already having its problems of its own, even before COVID. There was a lot of sort of, countries with, fiscal deficit, fiscal difficulties, a lot of, public debt that needed to be sorted out. So Latin America is gonna, the GDP is gonna, or the economy is gonna be reduced by 8.1% this year, more or less. And this is according to the latest projections. But then next year it's going to rebound again by plus 3.6%, right? So and you're already seeing some very good let's say improved projections in major economies like Brazil and Mexico, for example, which are key GDP components of the entire region. And then if you have regions like Central America, which is very very close to our audience. That proximity to Mexico, but also to, and particularly to the U.S. is also something good. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that as everything was put on hold, and then we can talk about sort of the availability of funding, which was also put on hold. But as M&A activity stopped, and it was a bit of a screeching halt in the first couple of months. It's already picking up, and then as economies start reopening and quote unquote life goes on, you're going to see those conversations, being postponed but not necessarily stopped, and we're starting to see deals getting done basically. Of course, revised terms. That's that has to be understandable. But the good news is that economies are starting to reopen. There is a question mark. We're already seeing some economies closing back a little bit, but generally speaking, the consensus is that the economy will grow back again in 2021. And for regions like Central America, it could be maybe 2-3 years, according to the projections, to get back to pre-COVID levels. So it's not. There's light at the end of a tunnel, which is something important. So these conversations have continue to happen. And of course, if there are good opportunities out there, both for international and for regional players, it's a good time to think about growing their business inorganically.
Perfect.
Jorge, I talked about how everybody stopped doing stuff, and Alejandro, you referred to that right at the outset. I'd say the one exception to that was, I think in almost every pending deal, the buyer had his lawyer look at the agreement to say, I got to get out of this deal. Is there a way to do it? And the seller said to his lawyer, look at the contract, figure out how we can force the seller to close. That was happening all over in every deal, including in Latin America. As Alejandro says, there's a big difference between everyone looking at their contract and everyone deciding they could get out. And it is relatively hard to get out of contracts. We were kind of interested to find out that over a third of the agreements that were in place at the time of COVID hit for pending deals, over a third had a provision that says a pandemic or epidemic or health emergency, use it in words, but that a pandemic is carved out of the material adverse change to the definition, so that any harm that's caused by the pandemic is not a basis for the buyer getting out of the deal. It's stunning that's the case. Why is that? We think that's because in the early 2000s, when the SARS epidemic hit, people started putting exceptions into their material adverse change conditions, saying it's not a material adverse change if it's caused by the pandemic. And sometimes people, things work their ways into agreement. People don't really stop paying attention to them, but a lot of agreements had that. So if you had a provision that says anything relating to the pandemic is a non-material adverse change, most sellers are in a position to argue more strongly that the buyer can't get out. But then, people looked at other provisions. I talked about this innocent conduct of business in the ordinary course. If you had to close your factories, if you had to draw down, go out and get some emergency financing, make layoffs, you could say that's all a violation of that provision. So people look to sue on that basis. But my experience is similar to Alejandro. There is so much uncertainty in being able to prove a material adverse change or another violation that many parties have dealt with this through renegotiating the price. But there have been some examples. I mean, Embraer and Boeing is in arbitration. Tiffany and LVMH is in litigation. So there have been some examples, but I agree in most cases, the parties figured out how much value harm had been done and how to sort of each take some of the cost of that value diminution.
It's impressive that you mentioned 1/3 of the agreements have that clause. I think as well in banking, they have that clause as well. And when we started to see this evolve in April, March, and so on, we were expecting a lot of litigation arbitrations because of that, but that didn't happen. That was the exception that we have an arbitration. Of course, the courts were closed, as were in many countries, as well in the US, the court system shut down. And we get back to the one-to-one meetings with the trust, the empathy, how you build back up a relationship. That has been proven very important in this. So what you mentioned, Paul and Alejandro, is respect of trust. When things go wrong on these situations, people find a way to conclude the business. And of course, there are others that want to take advantage of that situation, not to fulfill their obligations, and so forth and so forth. But luckily, we didn't see what the outcome that we were faced a lot of litigation on this, as well as arbitration. Business are starting to grow, and it's very, very optimistic, your figures, Alejandro. Of course, we wanted here in the Universidad Francisco Marroquín to bring real life practitioners to give us their point of view instead of just reading about what is in the papers or the magazines on the economics side. And then we find challenging the business community, how they are surpassing with this situation. And I don't see a lot of governments in Latin America helping the business community by no means. And some other countries have done that. Have you, I know this is a question that we may have been not so prepared, but you have seen countries helping, assisting the business community as a whole, because the IMF, Alejandro, in their press release said that one of the worst fears for the IMF is that the fiscal incentives are going to being taken away too soon in order to have a recovery. So I just lay out the question to comment.
Sure. I mean, to be honest, it's a complex question, of course, and you know, each country is dealing with their own situation, you know, accordingly. Some countries were in better shape than others. Um, some some countries were in better shape than others. Some countries were, you know, holding larger levels of reserves and have a debt maturity profile that it's sort of through the years, so they don't have to be dealing with negotiations right now. And you know, and in fact, they're able to, you know, through the central bank, they have what you know what can be considered sort of as firepower. So they can really sort of, you know, permeate liquidity into the system, and you know, create certain regulations that would are going to allow, you know, businesses to do better, and you know, and sort of, you know, work together with banks in several countries to, you know, help out with, you know, extension of credit maturities for certain segments of their loan portfolio. So you know, it's really hard to come up with, but on the other hand, there are some countries that are arrived to this crisis with, you know, very high fiscal deficits and having to deal with, you know, major debt restructurings, and they're having to, you know, they're working on discussions right now with the IMF in terms of, you know, basically getting some aid, because, you know, they you know, they have a lot of, you know, fiscal expenses, and they also need money to help out with the crisis. They need the money to help out with the crisis. So I guess the short answer, it really varies by country. You know, I'd like to think that each country is doing their absolute best, the best they can. But generally speaking, what you know, what you have, and you know, many people are there, out there, are suffering, and many businesses out there, not just in Latin America, in the entire world, are really going through tough times. But yeah.
Sorry for taking the country question. You are a banker, and of course, I will kind of change the question in respect
of
helping you, how the banks are dealing with this crisis with their clients. Because I think that is a more suited question to you. My apologies for saying about the country and everything, but on the banking sector, how the banks, have you seen, have helped the business community in this time of challenging times?
Okay, so generally speaking, banks in Latin America, in recent years, they were able to improve substantially their solidity, their financial ratios. So over the course of the last, and perhaps this comes from the last financial crisis, that, you know, banks in Latin America, even though they were not hurt so much in those days, they learned from what happened out there. And then Basel III there's been a lot of sort of initiatives on a global basis to, you know, make sure that banks are well prepared for a crisis. So the first point is, the good news is banks in general arrived with, you know, solid capitalization levels, with you know, relatively conservative non-performing loan ratios, and you know, with proper diversification models. So and with very good oversight from regulators throughout the region. So I think that's you know, the good news. The okay news is that just because of that, they've been able, and I think the average is anywhere between 40 and 50% of loan portfolios throughout the region. In some countries, it can be a bit more. In some countries, it's less. But let's say around 40% of loan portfolios have had some sort of extensions, whether it's, you know, 90 days or more. So they've been helping, you know, for the most part by doing that. some banks have been, voluntarily doing a bit more, but it depends on the strengths and the type of portfolio and the situation of their client segments. Okay, but I think that they have been doing that in order to help. I think what could be an issue down the road, and they need to prepare for that, and banks are preparing for that in terms of increasing their reserves, in terms of being much more diligent with the extensions of or the granting of new loans. They need to prepare for sort of the uncertainty that comes from once the moratorium, let's say, comes to an end. How much of all of those loans that have been extended and given more terms, how much of those are going to be non-performing? And so that's going to be, that's a little bit of an uncertainty. And banks are calculating that risk, and they're taking the right measures in order to be prepared for that. But I guess, to answer the question, I mean, that's how they've been, they've been extending the maturities of the loans. And then the other thing is, they have remained open for business, but, on a more sort of selected basis and perhaps with tighter parameters. But, banks are generally speaking open for business at this point.
Thank you, Alejandro.
It has been interesting in the U.S. I mean, your two questions are related, the government support and the bank support, because they're two separate complementary sources of funding. And, there are only really a couple of countries in the world that can print their own money, and they have been printing their own money, and that has helped the recovery tremendously, and it's helped M&A activity tremendously. And I think other countries that are not able to do that as easily are lagging in the recovery. I think on the bank side, again, I think a lot of people thought, this pandemic is going to cause a bank crisis because people are going to default on their loans. And the opposite happened. Encouraged by the US government, banks have done a tremendous amount of financing. We were busier in April and May on both capital markets investing, financing, and bank financing than we really have been in recent memory. That also helped the M&A market. And historically, acquisition financing has been harder to come by in Latin America, and that hurts the level of activity. And I agree with Alejandro. It's a little bit like the material adverse changes. All right, just renegotiate and sell it. Don't go to court. A lot of banks have said, am I going to do better putting this airline out of business, or am I going to be better restructuring the airline in terms of how much I can collect on my loans? And the banks have been very cooperative in working with all different types of companies to renegotiate the burden of the debt, to extend the maturities, have interest holidays, because the banks say this entity is worth more alive to me than it's worth in bankruptcy.
The protection of wealth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're doing it for their own selfish interest, which is fine.
I want to kind of wrap up because we have plenty of questions for the audience, and I want to wrap up with one final question to both of you, and then we open the discussions before we run out of time. As a banker, Alejandro, and as an M&A lawyer, business lawyer, what is your perspective on this fiscal year that is about to end? We are in the last quarter. How do you see the growth really on the next year? What is your perspective on this?
When you say 51%, sure, thank you. When you say 51% of executives are pursuing their M&A, that's impressive, but it means 49% aren't, and that's a big drop. But again, for those 50%, you got fewer people bidding on you. For international buyers, with the devaluation of many currencies in Latin America, the targets are now half the price than they were based on dollars, and you can take a lot more risk if you're paying half price for assets. You know, I think we've learned things and we haven't learned things. You know, in April, March, it was new and totally uncertain. And in a certain way, you can say it's now old and it's still totally uncertain. And Anthony Fauci, who's a sort of leading infectious disease person in the government, has said there's only one person knows, or one entity knows when this is going to be conquered, and that's the COVID virus itself. Nobody else knows when this is going to and has, you know, ultimate control over that. So I think, you know, we have to be patient. I think we have to take it one day at a time. I think we have to look at the sort of longer term strategic objectives and plans and say, is this a great opportunity, a great time to be, you know, advancing our strategic objectives. But, you know, my sense is it's going to take a while to come back. There is activity, but it's going to take a while to really come back strongly. And I think it'll be a few months longer in Latin America than in the US for it to come back. But the fact that there's all this financing going on in Brazil, I mean, that's, investors are saying, I want to own Brazilian companies. So it's, to me, it's only a matter of time before strategics or sovereign funds or PE firms say, I want to invest too.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Alejandro, your point of view?
Sure, very quickly, I think, you know, Paul said it, there is still uncertainty. There is still uncertainty. So even though we've seen sort of an improvement in the projected GDP growth, even though, you know, it's going to be sort of everyone's expecting a rebound next year with all the economies reopening. I think there is a lot of uncertainty out there that remains, and therefore, you know, companies need to be cautious and they need to be prudent. So it's still a time to continue doing what many companies have been doing, which is basically cutting down on unnecessary costs, cutting down on unnecessary capital expenditures, shoring up their liquidity, of course, being very upfront and having conversations with their financial providers to have the best mix in terms of, maturity profile for their financial debt, and also to the extent possible, have that sort of parental support in place or shareholder support if needed in order for business to continue to strive. But so it's definitely a period of time to be cautious, to be prudent, but at the same time, we have seen some opportunities. There are some opportunities, presented to the Latin American region, based on sort of, trade discussions going on, based on, the resiliency of some economies in some sectors, and the fact that, this is a region that, has good economic potential in terms of its ability to export as well. So, it's going to be a couple of years until things get back to, let's say, more normal levels. But at the same time, it seems like we're on the right track.
Good. Well, thank you very much for your time here. And I will now turn to certain Q&As, questions, sorry. And we go to, there is a lot, and I see that one is popping up in the same sense, and is antitrust. You mentioned that some companies were caught up with very strong financials and some others not, the survival of the fittest versus the survival of the weakest. And you see this in free market. Nevertheless, with the pandemic hits, and they are caught off guard, everyone, but some of them, their balance sheets are more robust, and they see, opportunity to take over many other companies or competitors. And antitrust regulations has been a discussion in your view, Paul and Alejandro, in respect of this. the antitrust authorities a little bit more on the watch if they're going to enact another bill in order not to create monopolies or so on, so on?
You know, it's an interesting idea for sure that, you know, can a competitor buy another competitor if that other competitor is going to fail, when if the other competitor was healthy, it wouldn't be able to buy it. And I would say I can speak mostly to the U.S. experience. In the margins, that can be helpful in convincing the regulator. But regulators are usually very skeptical of the claim as to why that competitor is buying the company, as to whether the target, and as opposed to somebody else, and there's so many buyers out there today, you know, why not a private equity firm that's not in the industry? And is this company really going to fail or not? So I think it is helpful in the margin, but I think regulators are very skeptical of that argument, and you really have to convince them that this is the absolute only option available to this target other than bankruptcy. If you can do that, then I think they'll be more sympathetic.
Thank you. Thank you.
I agree. That it would be sort of an ultimate compromise in the end from a regulator.
Okay, we have here a question and say how this decision.
I would just say one thing that they often do is they'll say, you can buy the whole company, but the healthy company, you have to turn around and divest this particular piece of it, or the part of it in this particular region or state. And sometimes the buyer says, well, that's the part I want the most. And the regulator said, yeah, but that creates antitrust problems. So yeah, you have to get rid of it. So it's not an all or nothing type analysis.
Okay. A lot of discussion on that topic. Well, let's move to another question, is how the decision of country leaders regarding shutting down each country and economic relief programs will affect and give leverage for international M&As. Who wants to take that question?
How did the decision of country leaders may affect M&A processes? Is that sort of
affect and give leverage for international M&As?
I think on my side, it comes down to, you know, if decisions all of a sudden are, decisions that are going to scare potential investors, and that could impact. If decisions are, focused more on attracting investors, that's going to be helpful. It just depends on the types of measures. I think, if all of a sudden you're a buyer looking into investing in another country, for example, and that country is probably going to be more restrictive in terms of taxes and ability to take dividends out, or labor laws, and then it's going to be tougher. But if you have countries out there promoting either investment, foreign direct investment, I think is something that is going to be needed going forward. So hopefully, and this is just my opinion, but hopefully there's going to be some incentives out there created by governments to promote foreign direct investment.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the markets, I think everybody knows this, but the markets are very cold-hearted when it comes to assessing whether a country is a good place to invest in. And if you say, well, gee, if the U.S. had been more careful or Brazil had been more careful, there would be, in opening up, there would be a lot fewer deaths. I think the markets, don't factor that in to deciding whether, however we've gotten to it, that Brazil is a good place to invest in, or the U.S. is a good place to invest in. So, I think they really look much more at the economic statistics rather than the loss of life statistics for better or for worse. So I think people really say, I think investors, people doing these deals, don't say, I'm going to pick the country that's done the best job controlling the pandemic, although often that helps to economic delivery. But I'm going to look at the countries that have best handled the economic side of things.
Okay, so there's another question related to finance and M&A. What is your appreciation of interest of local banks in Latin America in providing finance for M&A transactions in Latin American countries, especially for LBO transactions? And I think that is more to Alejandro, I guess.
Sure. In the recent past, in my own experience, we've worked on several acquisition finance transactions, and when they're large enough, banks tend to structure them and syndicate them, and we have seen that in the group of participating banks on these syndicated loans, we have seen local and regional players. So it's something that we've seen their participation both on the syndicated space. I'm not too sure about on a bilateral side, but on syndicated loans for sure.
Okay. We have another one that is, I think is really good. Is, in your opinion, how important for international buyer is the governance in Latin American companies and the existence of internal compliance officer? Do you think due diligence process will be improved after COVID? There are several new obligations and regulations for companies to protect the health of their employees and customers. So I guess this question is a lot of questions in one, but for the one who made the questions, one of the last model of this seminar, of the roundtable, will be subject to family-owned companies, and we will discuss furthermore that. But just to say, Alejandro and Paul, when you're dealing with multilatinas and as well as local companies that are willing to sell or to have a little bit of equity purchased by a foreigner, have you seen the compliance, the corporate governance, an issue in Latin America as well as a positive or a more on a negative side?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, certainly my sense is that companies with better governance and better compliance do better in terms of the price they get or in terms of, what their stock price does. And I think that's true in Latin America. I think that's true in the US. I'm not close to it, but I think there may have been some studies, and it'd be great topic for somebody at the university to sort of see if that can be proven out. So I do think there is a premium that's paid for good governance. I think the corruption problems have really reinforced that. And I think, I've heard a lot of US business people take the view that the COVID is a tragic episode, but it's really a unique kind of opportunity to develop a closer bond with your employees. That if you come out forcefully and say, your health and well-being and that of your families is what's most important to this company, and we're going to do everything we can to protect that, you really have a chance in a time of crisis to build an incredible bond with, and that's with your suppliers, your customers, all your stakeholders, your shareholders. And I think the companies, as part of the question, what's coming out of the COVID, I think the companies that have done that will come out of this stronger because they'll have, a sort of a better, workforce that believes more in their company.
And Jorge, just really quickly on the ability to obtain funding, there's also, I agree with Paul, and I think there's also a huge correlation. I think there's a big correlation between, corporate governance and solid, compliance practices in companies and their ability to obtain funding and financing.
Okay.
I've learned a lot in this. I was going to say, I've learned from Jorge, I've learned about how domestic lawyers are every bit as good and hardworking as lawyers any other place. And in talking with Alejandro, just in preparing this, he really has some interesting ideas about how to become a source or provider of acquisition funding in the region, which the region has lacked forever, and talk about something that would, promote the economies and help M&A activity. To me, that's a unique opportunity. And next year, you can come back and tell us how successful you've been doing
thing
that.
I have to say is the compliance.
We're gonna need New York law firms and regional domestic law firms for that.
There you go. There you go.
One thing that strikes me on a question like that, and is another part of the other model, is compliance. I think when we have bad press as Latin American countries in respect of FCPA, corruption, the rule of law, et cetera, now here in Latin America has become a hot topic, compliance. And I think that will put us on a better perspective in order to face crisis, in order to obtain funding, to have a future investor in our equity. So I think Latin American companies are evolving tremendously fast in order to be on the gold standards for international players that do business in Latin America. And the time has been limited. I think I will extend for a little bit, 5 minutes, because we are out of time. There is a question for Paul, for Mr. Paul Schnell. You mentioned that countries that can print their own money have better chances to recover quickly. Do you think that the inflation caused by money printing and long-term debt could be a real issue if expensive monetary policies such as QE are applied by countries? Well, that was a nice, tough question.
Well, it's a great question. It's probably more an economist to answer. I think that's the fundamental risk. I think that at a certain point, if the credit holders say, now you've printed too much money, that the only way to reduce the debt is through inflation. There is no other way to pay it off. You've got to make the debt lesser in value. It is amazing how, and with a weaker economy, that almost has encouraged deflationary trends. It's amazing how long, the U.S. has had since 2008, basically a policy of printing money, and it's lasted this long, but we're not going to know about it ahead of time. But one morning, I think there's a real risk that one morning people will wake up and say, it's too much. That's too much that's out there, and rates will go up, and inflation will come back, and I think that's a risk. I don't know if you go buy gold or not, but I think that it's a great question. I think there is a lot of risk there.
Okay, well, I have to wrap up, unfortunately, this roundtable, and I have to thank first and foremost Paul and Alejandro to take time for their busy schedule to participate with us and share their views on practical issues that are really important for us in Latin America. I appreciate very much on behalf of Universidad Francisco Marroquín your time. Also, I want to express my gratitude to all the participants who have joined us. It has been overwhelming response to this, and I have to do a little commercial here for these roundtables. The second model, which will be in late October, will be focused on taxes and labor obligations in the area of compliance when you're dealing with an acquisition. The third model will be arbitration and dispute resolutions clauses in respect of breach of any kind of obligation and agreement due to this pandemic. We're going to have a case study on this with international participants as well. And the last one is the family offices as well as the family-owned companies. Are they prepared for growth or to take a little bit further in investment, and how this has affected them, corporate governance, compliance? That will be subject to the discussion on them. So thank you very much, everyone that took the time. My sincere gratitude to Alejandro and Paul to taking the time and to share their views on this. This seminar will be recorded, so I guess you will be available online. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I say bye and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.